Many would say today in League of Legends there are a lot of champions with overloaded kits, passives that are too passives, abilities which read as paragraphs, and whatever this is. Things used to be much simpler. Warwick would run up to you and just kinda hit you, Sion would run up to you, stun you, and then hit you, Master Yi would run up to you, Q you, and yeah, you get the point. Who was the original overloaded kit champion? Well, Nidalee wasn't simple, having Cougar form unlocking a whole new ability bar, but imagine a champion who had a ranged skill shot, damage dealing, stealth reveal, gap closer, nuke, and that's just his Q. There are very few champions who seem to always remain relevant through shifting seasonal changes. Some are benched by the community until reworked, some are permanently banned out of relevance. A few champions always seem to be worth picking. Your Ezreal or Braum in the bot lane, the Oriannas of the mid, maybe Renekton top, but for the jungle there is only one true king. A champion that's seen widespread play from the depths of Iron to the heights of the World Finals, a champion that's often on the edge of int or carry, and a champion that allows for some of the highest expression of skill and outplay in League of Legends. This is a Launch to Live, a series where I hope to cover every League of Legends champion story in full, from their release dates to the times when they were the best and permabanned, and the times where they were the worst and considered a troll pick, their major esports appearances and who pioneered them to competitive greatness, and not forgetting how they did in solo queue as well. The major reworks, the bugs, any drama, I hope to cover it all. Join me as we embark on a journey back through up to nearly 14 years of history, balance changes and patches. 2011 was a wild year for League of Legends. The game had exploded in popularity since release in late 2009. The first World Championship was held in Sweden, and Riot managed to dish out some 24 champions in that time frame too. Jarvan IV, Vayne, Riven, and Ahri all joined the league in 2011, and so did Lee Sin. This next clip might look quite familiar. It was from Lee Sin's April Fool's Day announcement. And whilst the video was a joke, the 73rd champion to join League was anything but. When the real champion spotlight dropped, what we saw was a powerful toolkit of burst, sustain, and so much mobility. He was shown in the highlight to be both a top laner as well as a jungler. These were the days when Riot tended to design a champion with a role in mind, instead of just making something with paragraphs for abilities that it turns out can work near enough anywhere. Lee was also one of the first few energy-based champions, with only the trio of ninjas, Shen, Kennen, and Akali coming before him, though this was an aspect of the game players already had some time to get used to. They also recommended rune and mastery pages in the spotlight too. As a jungler back then, you would have to make sure you're getting your armor seals or face struggles on your first clear. But the idea behind Lee Sin predated his release considerably. In fact, a blind monk was one of the first 6 champion ideas that Riot ever had for League of Legends, alongside the likes of Chemical Man and Undead Warrior. You can guess who those ended up being. Very early footage featuring a spinning wheel like we're playing a fighting or a racing game showed us 6 champions, including Zizun, the blind monk. A notably different design to release, with a large hat, a cane, and some prayer beads and or knuckle dusters, who, according to one of his abilities, was built like a brick wall on roids. Nice description there, Riot. A later official in-game trailer from 2009 again shows us that Blind Monk was still well in the works and being figured out, this time appearing in what would eventually become his traditional skin, alongside the likes of Jax, Morgana, Kayle, and many more of the founding champions of League of Legends. There was even an ability set extracted from the closed beta dating March 2009, where Lee Sin could see stealthed units near him passively, imagine that working on wards, and the rest of his kit involved creating a copy of himself similar to a Shaco clone, and then kind of running up to somebody a little bit faster than normal and stunning them. It doesn't look up to much by these days standards, but there was way less mobility in the game then. In fact, many of the ideas from early Lee Sin were taken and given to Udyr instead. From these abilities you can see the inspiration for Burst Stance charge into stun, and Flurry being quite similar to Tiger Stance's rapid attacks. Either way, I'm going to go ahead and say what we ended up getting on the launch was worth the wait. Lee Sin redefined skill expression and mobility in a champion, and if you went all the way back to 2011 now to play Release Lee Sin again, you would more or less know his kit inside out. It's amazing how little this champion has changed over the years and how he keeps being picked at all levels of play. Very few others fall into this category. While some of the other founding champions saw frequent updates, ability overhauls, or entire reworks, Lee Sin kept that aura of familiarity, of consistency, and that's one of the big reasons people keep going back to him. From day one, each of his abilities, except his ultimate, had two parts to it. His Q fires a projectile and follows up with a dash, his W shields and dashes to an ally and grants Vamp, his E does AoE damage and slows nearby enemies, and his ult knocks the target back and causes them to collide with nearby enemy units. There's been tweaks to numbers, small additions made, but Lee Sin has survived over a decade of gameplay changes whilst remaining very true to his roots. Some of the larger mechanical changes throughout the champion's life were in Season 4 when 50% cooldown reduction was added onto his W when it was used on an ally, allowing for even more frequent flashy plays and sustain, or the fact that Cripple, that's the recast of his E, used to have a pretty hefty 60% attack speed slow at max rank. Back in the early days, you would just want to get onto the back line to ruin the enemy AD carry's day by tagging them with this ability, never mind thinking about kicking them back into your own team. But one of the biggest scares that Lee Sin mains ever had was not too long after release on June 22nd, 2011. So in old League of Legends, some things worked a little bit differently. One of those ways were wards used to be coded in the same way that minions were. This meant that if you were on 1 health and needed to avoid a skill shot, you could place a ward down and it would block it. It was a fairly cheap way to guarantee living in a situation where you would otherwise have to dodge. According to patch notes, you could even ward to stop Rammus's Powerball early too. Anyways, on June 22nd, 2011, Riot made a change to where wards and spawned minions could no longer be affected by spells, meaning that Ezreal Q was not going to be randomly blocked anymore. What this also meant was that you could no longer ward jump. Suddenly, Jax and Katarina were missing what was often an escape path from a gank or a gap closer over a wall. Lee Sin lost a lot more than that. Lee Sin's W only ever worked on allies, meaning he lost a gap closer, an escape, and biggest of all, a huge playmaking tool for getting behind important enemy carries and kicking them back into his own team. Fortunately, a world without ward hops didn't last too long because you better believe players were not happy about this tool being removed from the game. About 2 weeks later, this interaction was brought back, but ward jumps would now reveal a ward for about 2 seconds. Better than nothing, because the Blind Monk has, ironically, always valued wards as a playmaking tool more so than any other champion in League of Legends history. Having that extra little jump via wards has opened up possibilities that players would have never dreamed of when he first released. And whilst Lee has always embodied the idea of great early, falls off later, creativity with his ultimate combos keep him forever relevant in the hands of a great player. So when Lee Sin first hit the live game a mere 2.5 months before the first World Championship ever, the stage was set for this legendary jungler to make a huge debut on the biggest stage in the world. Or you would have hoped so anyway. In reality, the pros of the time didn't really know what to do with this recent addition to the game. He was picked a total of 2 times in the whole tournament, and neither appearance saw him in the jungle. One of the appearances was in Group Stage B, which saw Zan's mid Vec take on none other than Hotshot GG's Nidalee. This matchup saw Lee Sin get bullied a ton in lane, but largely be able to sustain himself up and not lose too badly. But the team fighting prowess, shall we say, of CLG saw them to victory in this game and set to advance, with Lee Sin not finding too much room for impact against the point-and-click CC of Nunu and Taric. The second game of Lee Sin was a win, you'll be glad to know. No thanks to the performance that was put on by the Lee Sin player, however. It saw 2 big team names of the time. North America's Epic Gamer take on Europe's hopeful Fnatic. In this game, Doublelift locked in a bot lane Lee Sin for North America, which was met by casters with a similar kind of response that you would get nowadays.
Have a laning Sorry, I'm confused. I are confused. This American game does not make any sense to me.
That's not something, you see in the European
No, you don't
games.
see a laning Lee Sin. That's just strange.
And we didn't even have to get 1 minute into the game before Fnatic deployed the tried and true Death Brush tactic to welcome EG's team to the Rift, before heading straight on over to bot lane to collect some more gold from the Lee Sin fund. After that, an extremely aggressively equipped Lee Sin with Ignite Exhaust was left so far behind against a point-and-click stun from Taric and High Burst on top of a healing reduction from Misfortune that the lane was kind of over before it started.
Works. Okay, but still, look at that. 81 farm for Misfortune and 49 for Lee Sin. That is not a good lane.
And the lane matchup went about as well as you would have expected it to. Nevertheless, in the end, the North American side was able to push to victory thanks to a stand-up performance from Salsa's Vladimir and Dandin's Akali top. Though can I just say Fnatic were playing Alistar mid, who built Medjay's and Deathcap. Yeah, it was a different game then. So Lee Sin didn't exactly get off to a good start in the first World Championship, but as time went on and people stopped last picking Lee Sin in lane against hard counters, remarkably he started to look better and better. Former Moscow 5-member Diamondprox was once quoted as saying, "I still believe that if you haven't learned how to play a good Lee Sin, you cannot call yourself a jungler." And it was Diamondprox who many attribute to being the first player to really start getting the performance out of Lee Sin that he was fully capable of, managing to get his hands on Lee Sin twice during the second World Championship and winning on both occasions. Pros were having a hard time against the relentless pressure and playmaking ability of the Blind Monk, and Diamondprox's pick started to attract bans just so teams didn't have to learn how to play against him. Taipei Assassins, who would go on to win Season 2, would make a point to ban Diamondprox's Lee in both of their semi-final games. But this was just the start of Lee Sin's legacy of dominance and how important of a pick he would become to master. Diamondprox would go on to say in a later interview, "I don't know a single jungler who can be compared to Insec and the other top junglers who can't play an amazing Lee Sin. Insec himself plays him almost ideally. Perhaps he's even better than me there." It was during All-Stars 2013 Shanghai that a play was made that would become synonymous with the skill expression that Lee Sin's kit made possible. It was a match between Europe and Korea when this play was made on the biggest stage in the world so far.
Talks about who will maybe get that as Lee Sin is going to go in the towards Yellow Pete. He gets knocked up. Kennan's going to go into the middle, but Yellow Pete will die. Madline's going to fall down as well. Edward going very, very low. Gets a pull off in the end, but they're ripping through the rest of them. Double kills coming out for Jai, and they're not done just yet. They're going to chase them.
It may have been far from the first time this maneuver had been pulled off, but the community jumped on this huge play, naming it after the person who had shown it to the world. Insec. Q into a ward jump and kick a threatening enemy player back into your team, a move that won team fights the moment that they began, and a move that secured a late game value for Lee Sin where his scaling was otherwise lacking. Later in the year, the third World Championship for League of Legends would take place, where an up-and-coming Korean powerhouse team would begin an era of dominance nobody has been able to replicate yet. SKT T1, Humandu and Piglet Bot, Impact top, Faker mid, and Bengi in the jungle. It was already a stacked roster, and Faker would even attribute much of his mid lane success to his jungler's unreal amount of pressure and creativity with ganks. Some even call Bengi his third summoner spell. Out of the 9 games Bengi got his hands on Lee Sin, 8 of them were wins. Lee saw either a pick or ban in just under 2/3 of the total amount of games played, with only Lee's being the target of more interaction. During this season, Lee Sin had some of the best access to ward hops that he has ever seen, being able to get wards from both Spirit of the Ancient Golem, as well as what was more intended to be a support item to aid with excess spending on wards, Sightstone. Best of all, every trip back to base would refill your bags with 3 to 4 free ward jumps. If there was ever a season for playmaking Lee Sins, this was it. Bengi would begin to attract bans on his Lee Sin, but back then it was just picking your poison against how SKT was built. In fact, after Worlds 2013, they went home and finished their entire winter season without dropping a single game. Next year, the Season 4 Championship would see one of the highest presences for Lee Sin ever in a competitive format. It wasn't just opinion that you needed to have a good Lee Sin to jungle anymore, it was a fact. He was chosen by 16 different players in 43 separate appearances and was picked or banned in 92% of games held. This season saw a pivot in itemization due to the more aggressive spirit of the Elder Lizard jungle item, which would add a true damage over time effect after dealing physical damage, though at this point Lee Sin still had access to Sightstone to carry him to playmaking capability. Samsung Blue's Dan D was one of the standout performers of the tournament across a wide variety of champions, and he also arguably landed one of the greatest Lee Sin kicks to ever have been pulled off on a large stage. At the time, it was dubbed the Penta Kick.
Oh, I think Bang's in trouble. There's the kick. They kick him in. Oh, the death sentence Spada nearly comes in. There's the box. And MVP Ozone is going to absolutely slaughter Xenix.
So Lee Sin had taken competitive League of Legends by storm, each season rising in power. Fast forward to 2016 and the jungle saw another big itemization update. The key new addition for Lee Sin was the Trekker's Knife. This gave him the previously available wards from building into Spirit of the Ancient Golem without having to commit into a tank build. This meant you had the flexibility of free vision and playmaking tools from the wards, and the ability to build into a warrior enchant to push early leads and take more aggressive plays. Lee Sin ended up being the most played jungler during this World Championship, with the most games played from Rock's Tiger's Peanut, H2K Gaming's Jankos, and of course SKT T1 Bengi. It seemed as though competitive viability had been permanently assured for the Blind Monk, ever since he was pioneered to prominence by the likes of Diamondprox, Insec and Bengi. But all good things have to come to an end, and Season 7 and onwards would see a big meta shift in the jungle. The problem? Tanks. Tanks that could outscale, out-damage, and most worryingly, out-gank Lee Sin. Cinderhulk Beast, Jarvan IV, Gragas, and a recently reworked Sejuani dominated the jungle.
To stop that playmaking, but I get reminded of my friend Jake Spawn Tiberi telling me about something. I think it was back in 2015. He was talking about Gragas. I'm like, why don't you pick Lee Sin in the jungle anymore? He's like, no, Gragas is just better Lee Sin. And we saw Khan go into that backline and demonstrate that you can do all of that CC, but you get to do it on everyone.
With Sedge attracting a near 100% pick ban for this year's Worlds, Lee only saw a sorry 4 picks throughout 2017. In Season 8, further disaster struck for Lee Sin as Trekker's Knife was removed from the game midway through the season. This change would go on to be present in that year's Worlds too, where powerful duelists such as Nocturne and Xin Zhao made the most of challenging Smite to become the most popular choices. Lee Sin at this point was not in the best spot he had ever been, though he never had any huge swinging changes or reworks, he just wasn't keeping power with the times. No longer were tanks just units that stood at the front and had a lot of CC, now they could get ahead and hard carry. No longer was Lee Sin among the elite clear speed junglers who had enough health to gank afterwards. So many more junglers could achieve this now, and no longer did Lee Sin have access to 3 or 4 wards at all times after basing. Now he actually had to invest in them, as did any other jungler. And though we can say Lee has always had the chance to be valuable early to late through outplaying, well, it's been many years since Insec shocked the world with his play. What casters called so hard to execute then is now just seen as, oh yeah, my AD was out of position there, any gold player could pull that off any day of the week. Pros had experienced years of scrimming and competing with Lee Sin masters. They knew the limitations the champion had, and those big flashy plays grew more and more difficult to pull off against increasingly prepared competition. In short, Lee Sin needed help if he was going to see the light of competition on the world stage once again. And he got the buffs he needed. Between seasons 9 and 10, pretty much all aspects of Lee Sin's kit were buffed, from base stat scaling, reduced ability cooldowns, and extra damage. Gore Drinker was also added in pre-season 11, an item that did everything you could possibly want on Lee Sin. Healing, AoE, and a nice bit of extra burst into his combos. Between all the small incremental buffs, Lee climbed back from obscurity, and during Worlds 2021 was not only the most played jungler, but the most played champion in the tournament, being picked or banned in 97% of 121 games played, particularly being favoured by LCK teams, with Genji's Clid playing Lee 7 times, and Damwon Kia's Canyon getting a perfect 6-0 across all his games played on Lee. So Lee Sin may have been down for a period period in competitive play, but never out. Whilst the jungle has changed much over the years, Lee has remained a champion that's always been super important in pro play. Remember what Diamond Proc said? I still believe that if you haven't learned how to play a good Lee, you cannot call yourself a jungler. And all these years later, it still seems to be very much the case. And whilst Lee Sin has a legacy of incredible moments in competitive play, in solo queue, the average Lee Sin is a little bit more variable, shall we say. The gulf between the guy who just saw an insect play and thinks, gee, I'm gonna try that out in my first ranked game of the day, and the player who has several million mastery points in high elo is huge. I mean, sure, it is on any champ, but especially Lee Sin. In solo queue, there is that pressure that you must get something done early because you've picked an early game champion, because whilst Lee is and always has been great early, even small mistakes, overcommitting or playing too aggressive can set you behind. And when you get behind, it's often the case that you stay there, making Lee a volatile pick in solo queue. Despite this, he has always been popular. Between season 6 and 8, he was near enough always in the top 5 champion picks in solo queue globally. The big plays may have been hard to pull off, but people wanted to try the flashy moves that they see in pro games. They wanted to pull off a huge team-winning kick, or just to give this champion a go after getting rolled by him in a previous game. And Lee Sin is so insanely replayable. The depth on his combos, ability to outplay, and the feeling you are always learning and improving make for a very satisfying champion to keep coming back to. Stats dating back from mid-2014 to today show us the story of a jungler who for much of his life has been above a 20% popularity ratio in plat or above. That's like saying 1 in 5 games have a Lee Sin in them, and that's not because he's always been OP or freelo. The win rate history shows us that, where he's practically permanently below 50%, which I've probably contributed to quite a bit over the years. It's just Lee Sin is fun to play and outplay with, and for a champion designed and changed so little since 2011, there's just nothing quite like him. Today he remains as popular as ever heading into a new season and another jungle item rework. And when you think you've seen all the combos Lee can do, all the variations of the kicks, the best players and innovators are still coming up with absolutely unreal plays, such as Canyon's drive-by kick in this clip. This is possibly one of the greatest mechanical plays in League of Legends history. If this was done in a bigger tournament, this would be up there with Xpeke's backdoor on Kassadin or Faker's Z outplay versus Ryu. So you see the Sivir get kicked back into Canyon's own team, but the amount of skill that goes into this play is incredible. He lands the Q, Ward jumps to the side to do 2 things. First of all, to avoid getting stunned out of taking the Q by Gragas, but more importantly, having W active allows Lee to use other abilities during his second Q. So he takes the Q, predicts Sivir is going to spell shield, smites off the spell shield during his ultimate windup, and then lands a perfect kick onto the enemy's main carry into his team. At this point, Damwon Kia had 1 Nexus turret and 1 inhibitor. For a game at the level they are playing here, they had lost. There is no way they should have ever won this game, but a miraculous play from Canyon not only brought them back into the game, but won them this game. And that's why Lee Sin is so well loved and played all the way from the bottom to the top. He's the embodiment of skill expression and outplays on a single champion. He can make the impossible happen and swing games back around that he has no business doing. From a rocky start during early development to being trialed as a bot laner at the first Worlds, eventually ending up as one of the most consistent picks both in pro play and solo queue. There are few champions in League of Legends who have remained as popular as Lee Sin, the Blind Monk. And now that we've talked about his start to where he is now, I think it's pretty easy to see why. Thank you so much for watching. This is what I hope to make the first video of many on the various champions of League of Legends. I have some ideas for who I want to cover next. There are so many interesting stories to be told here. So if you like the video and want to see more, drop a like and a subscribe so you don't miss the future uploads. And as always, many thanks for watching and listening in. I'll see you all in the next one very soon.